After I had a stroke at 72, my only son offered to take care of me. I trusted him with everything, but he was secretly stealing from me, draining my life savings and taking my most priceless possession. Keep watching to see exactly what I did when I found out. And trust me, you want to hear the real reason why he betrayed me. I was standing in my bedroom, holding a letter that would change everything. My hands shook as I read the words that proved my worst fears. The son I had protected was the very person who had been destroying me. At that moment, I faced an impossible choice between family loyalty and saving myself. Let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Orrin Blackwood, a 72-year-old retired park ranger from Ashland, Oregon. For 40 years, I found peace in the quiet woods, watching over the land I loved. Independence defined my entire life until one morning changed everything forever. The stroke hit me like lightning on a clear day. One minute I was making coffee. The next I was lying on my kitchen floor. My left side went numb, my speech became jumbled, and my world turned upside down. The doctors at Ashland Community Hospital told me I would need months of recovery and ongoing care. That was when my eldest son, Garrett, stepped in. He was 45 years old, worked in real estate, and lived about 30 minutes away in Medford. Garrett had always been the responsible one, the son who handled things when they got complicated. When he offered to help manage my affairs during recovery, I felt grateful beyond words. I should have seen the warning signs right away. Within weeks, Garrett had moved all my important papers to his house for safekeeping. He explained that my condition made me vulnerable to mistakes, and he wanted to protect me from any financial errors. He also took the legal papers of my landed property, which was my most prized possession. Now, let me tell you a bit of this landed property, which became a prized possession of mine. As a retired park ranger who had worked for 40 years protecting forests, I felt the need to acquire this property to serve as insurance for myself. 20 years earlier, I ventured into a timber business which failed woefully, and it had cost me most of my savings and put enormous financial stress on my family. Purchasing this property was a way of rebuilding and proving I could succeed with forest-related ventures. It symbolized my recovery from that earlier financial disaster. This landed property was approximately 45 acres, and its location was near my old timber venture. So, when Garrett took all the important papers to his house for safekeeping, it seemed reasonable at the time, especially since my memory felt fuzzy after the stroke. Dr. Vivian Martinez, the doctor in charge of my health case, became my primary physician during this period. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who had been treating seniors for over 20 years. During my regular checkups, she began asking questions that made me uncomfortable. She wanted to know about my living conditions, my daily care, and whether I had enough help at home. Then there was Margaret Johnson, she who entered my life as my caretaker 3 months after the stroke. She was a calm lady in her 30s who had worked with seniors for almost a decade. Margaret came to my house every day to help with meals, medication, and basic tasks. She had kind eyes and a patient way of speaking that put me at ease immediately. At first, everything seemed to be going well, with Garrett managing my finances. He would visit twice a week to discuss my care and show me papers that needed signing. He explained each document carefully, telling me they were for medical expenses, home maintenance, or other necessary costs related to my recovery. But small things started bothering me. My monthly statements stopped coming to the house, and when I asked about them, Garrett said he was handling everything to reduce my stress. The cable television service got canceled because of budget concerns, though I had never had money problems before. My longtime housekeeper stopped coming, and Garrett explained we needed to cut unnecessary expenses. Margaret began noticing changes too. She would arrive at my house to find that basic supplies were running low. The refrigerator often had less food than expected, and sometimes the utility bills seemed overdue. When Margaret mentioned these concerns to me, I defended Garrett, explaining that he was working hard to manage everything during a difficult time. Back at the hospital, Dr. Vivian Martinez grew more direct during my appointments. She asked specific questions about my financial situation and whether I felt safe at home. Her questions made me defensive because they seemed to suggest that something was wrong with my care. I trusted my son completely and could not imagine that he would ever do anything to harm me. The first real warning came from an unexpected source. There was this woman named Queeneth. She was Garrett's ex-wife. She called me one afternoon while Margaret was helping with lunch. She had not spoken to me in over 2 years, not since the bitter divorce she had with Garrett. Queeneth told me she was worried about some things she had heard, but she would not give me specific details over the phone. Queeneth's phone call stayed with me for days. She had sounded nervous, almost frightened, when she mentioned her concerns about Garrett. Before hanging up, she told me to be careful and to watch my finances closely. Her warning felt like a cold wind blowing through my comfortable assumptions about my son. The next week, Margaret arrived at my house with a troubled expression. She then asked if I had any plans to sell my 45 acres landed property or change my living situation. I told her I didn't. She looked concerned but didn't say anything more. I asked why she brought it up, and she just said I shouldn't worry about it, that it wasn't important. Then she went ahead to say that he had been grocery shopping for me and noticed that my debit card was declined at the store. When she called the bank, they told her my account had insufficient funds. This shocked me completely because I had always maintained a healthy balance from my pension and savings. When I called Garrett about the banking issue, he seemed prepared with an explanation. He told me that my medical expenses had been higher than expected, and some old debts from my past failed timber business had resurfaced. He mentioned something about the timber business I had tried to start 20 years ago, saying creditors were now demanding payment on forgotten obligations. This explanation confused me because the timber venture had been a complete failure, but I thought all the debts were settled long ago. My memory of that period felt hazy, partly because of the stroke and partly because those had been painful years I preferred not to remember. The business had cost me most of my savings and put enormous stress on my family. Dr. Vivian Martinez noticed my increasing anxiety during my next appointment. She asked direct questions about my financial situation and whether I had access to my own bank accounts. When I explained that Garrett was managing everything, her expression grew serious. She told me that elderly patients sometimes face financial exploitation, even from family members they trust. Her words hit me like a physical blow. The idea that my own son might be stealing from me seemed impossible to accept. I had raised Garrett, taught him right from wrong, and sacrificed for his education and future. How could the boy who used to help me plant trees in the forest grow up to become someone who would hurt me? At the time, I had no idea that Margaret had started paying close attention to my daily finances. One Saturday afternoon, she approached me and said she'd noticed that my grocery budget had been cut drastically, forcing her to buy the cheapest food. She pointed out that the quality of our meals had gone down and that sometimes there wasn't enough money for proper nutrition. She also mentioned that my prescription medications were often delayed because of payment problems. As I listened, I didn't know how to respond. Margaret could tell I was overwhelmed. Then she said there was something important she needed to share with me. She told me that one afternoon, while Garrett was visiting and wasn't aware that she was in the guest bedroom, she overheard Garrett's phone conversation that deeply concerned her. I asked what it was about, and she said Garrett had been talking to someone about property values and development opportunities. Margaret said Garrett specifically mentioned my 45 acres landed property and talked about how much it could be worth and the possibility of selling it. She added that the way the conversation sounded, it seemed like a sale was already being planned, without my knowledge. When I asked Margaret why she hadn't told me right away, she said he felt uncomfortable bringing it up. She explained that's why she had earlier asked me if I was planning to sell my land or change my living situation. When I told her I wasn't, she looked concerned but didn't push the topic further. After hearing all of this, I didn't know what to think anymore. It was hard to process the idea that my own son might have sold my most prized possession. I had been saving it to hand over to him someday, and it felt like my redemption after my failed business. I couldn't believe or even imagine that Garrett would do something like that. I told Margaret I was going to look into the matter. That same evening, an old friend named Barnaby Thorne came to visit me. Barnaby was a retired land surveyor who now spent his days birdwatching in the forest around my 45-acre property. He was quiet and observant, always carrying journals where he recorded everything he saw on his outdoor walks. The locals called him Whisper because he moved so silently through the woods. Barnaby said he had seen some strange activity near my land. He spotted Garrett meeting with a few men in suits, pointing at different parts of the property and discussing something that looked serious. Barnaby added that if I was planning to sell the land, he was surprised I hadn't been there myself for the negotiations. The situation became more troubling when my longtime neighbor, Mrs. Chun, stopped by to check on me. She mentioned that someone had been asking questions about my property around the neighborhood. The person wanted to know about my health, my family situation, and whether I might be interested in selling my land. Mrs. Chun found these inquiries strange and invasive. All these separate incidents began forming a pattern that I could not ignore. The financial problems, the mysterious meetings, the questions about my property, and Queenetha's warning all pointed towards something terrible happening in my life. Yet I still could not bring myself to believe that Garrett was capable of such betrayal. Now, before we proceed, it's very important to say that if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. By liking, subscribing, and even leaving a short comment of where you are watching from, you are helping me grow this channel so that other seniors like you can find this video and learn the graceful wisdom tips that it offers. I share real stories from elders who face tough situations just like this. These stories aren't just for entertainment. They're meant to help us learn and grow wiser as seniors. We can sometimes become vulnerable, and that's why it's so important to learn from the experiences and mistakes of others. Together we can protect ourselves and protect each other through shared wisdom. Now back to our story. After Mrs. Chun left, I felt more confused than ever. The visit had forced me to confront the possibility that something was seriously wrong with my situation. Yet when Garrett arrived that evening, he seemed like a completely different person than the one everyone else was describing. He appeared genuinely caring and concerned about my welfare. But still, I confronted Garrett. My voice trembled. I asked him directly if he was trying to sell the land. Without flinching, he laughed and said, "Dad, those men were investors I invited to help value the land for future plans, not to sell it." He went on about building a legacy project in my name, complete with emotional charm and slick talk that sounded rehearsed. It was so convincing, so polished, that for a moment I felt ashamed for doubting him. His words calmed my fears, and just like that, I dismissed every accusation I had heard. Garrett brought old photo albums with him and spent hours sitting beside my bed. He showed me pictures from his childhood, reminding me of camping trips we had taken together and lessons I had taught him in the forest. His eyes filled with tears as he talked about how hard I had worked to provide for our family after his mother died. He told me that his only goal was to protect me from the financial disaster that had nearly destroyed us 20 years ago. The timber business failure had been devastating for our entire family, and Garrett said he still had nightmares about those difficult years. He claimed that some of the old creditors from that period were trying to take advantage of my current weakness. This emotional conversation shook me to my core. I began to question whether my suspicions about Garrett were fair or accurate. Maybe my stroke had affected my judgment more than I realized. Perhaps the people around me were seeing problems that did not really exist. The boy crying beside my bed seemed incapable of the calculated cruelty everyone was suggesting. Dr. Vivian Martinez noticed my change in attitude during my next appointment. When she asked about my financial concerns, I defended Garrett more strongly than before. I told her that he was trying to protect me from old debts and that his management of my affairs was actually helpful. Her expression showed disappointment and worry about my sudden shift in perspective. Margaret also observed my newfound uncertainty about the situation. He came to me one fateful morning telling me that he had been documenting some unusual or rather inappropriate financial incidents with my account for weeks. But at that point, I felt less interested in hearing about them. When she tried to discuss the grocery budget problems or the delayed medication payments, I would change the subject or make excuses for Garrett's behavior. The confusion in my mind grew stronger each day. Half of me wanted to believe that Garrett was the loving son who was trying to help me through a difficult period. The other half of me recognized that the financial problems and suspicious activities were too numerous to ignore. This internal conflict left me feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. One evening, I made a discovery that changed everything. Just beside my bed was an old metal box that I had forgotten about for years. I recognized the box, but I couldn't explain how the box got to the side of my bed. I thought that maybe Margaret must have stumbled on it while rearranging and kept it in a visible place where I could see. Inside the box were documents from the timber business, including contracts, debt records, and correspondence with creditors from that painful period. Among these papers was a letter from a collection agency. The letter was several years old and dealt with a small remaining debt from the timber venture. As I read the letter, my hands began to shake. The debt mentioned in the letter matched exactly what Garrett had been telling me about old creditors coming forward to demand payment. At that moment, a terrible possibility entered my mind. What if Garrett was telling the truth about the old debts? What if he really was trying to protect me from financial predators who wanted to take advantage of my current vulnerability? The letter seemed to support his explanation about why my money was running low and why he needed to manage my finances so carefully. But something about the timing bothered me. How had Garrett known about this old debt when I had completely forgotten about it myself? Why had these creditors waited until now, when I was most vulnerable, to demand payment? The questions multiplied in my mind, but I could not find clear answers to any of them. The weight of that collection letter pressed down on me like a heavy stone. I sat alone in my room, staring at the document and wrestling with emotions I could barely understand. Part of me felt relief that maybe Garrett was telling the truth about protecting me. Another part of me felt deep shame for doubting my son in the first place. When Margaret returned from her break, I made a decision that would haunt me for weeks to come. Instead of asking her if she saw the box while arranging my bedroom, or showing her the letter and discussing what it might mean, I chose to hide it. I carefully folded the paper and pushed it deep beneath my bed. The metal creaked as I pressed it down, sealing away what felt like evidence of my own confusion. I was too embarrassed to talk about it, because the details in that box reminded me of the business risk I took years ago that nearly destroyed my family's well-being. I didn't even ask Margaret if he saw it. I just wanted the matter to stay buried. The act of hiding that letter felt like betraying Margaret, who had been working so hard to help me understand my situation. But I convinced myself that I was protecting Garrett from unfair suspicion. Maybe I was also protecting myself from having to face painful truths about my past financial mistakes. The secret felt heavy in my chest, but I carried it alone. Over the following days, my behavior toward everyone changed. When Dr. Vivian Martinez asked about my concerns during appointments, I gave shorter answers and avoided eye contact. When Margaret tried to discuss the financial irregularities he had noticed, I would dismiss his observations or change the subject entirely. I had created a wall around myself to protect the fragile hope that my son was innocent. Garrett seemed to sense my internal struggle and began visiting more frequently. During these visits, he would bring small gifts and spend long hours talking about family memories. He shared stories about his childhood fears during the timber business failure, describing how scared he had been when bill collectors came to our house. These conversations painted him as a traumatized boy who had grown up determined to prevent our family from ever facing financial ruin again. The emotional manipulation was subtle but powerful. Garrett would remind me of times when I had been absent due to work, suggesting that his current involvement in my finances was his way of making up for the care I had missed. He portrayed his control over my money as love, sacrifice, and protection rather than exploitation. My guilt about past parenting failures made me vulnerable to these signs. Margaret began to notice my growing withdrawal from the investigation we had been conducting together. She could see that something had changed in my attitude, but she could not understand what had caused the shift. Her frustration was evident in her interactions with me, though she tried to remain patient and supportive despite my sudden resistance to her help. The isolation I had created around myself became increasingly painful. I felt caught between two impossible choices: believing that my son was a criminal who was stealing from me, or believing that everyone else was wrong about a situation they did not fully understand. Both options seemed to lead to heartbreak and loss of relationships that mattered deeply to me. Queeneth tried to contact me again during this period, but I refused to take her calls. I told myself that she was a bitter ex-wife who wanted to cause trouble for Garrett out of spite. In reality, I was afraid of what she might tell me. If she had additional information that confirmed my worst fears, I was not ready to hear it yet. The truth hit like a bolt of lightning on what felt like a normal afternoon. Margaret came to me and said that while she was helping organize my bedroom, she found an old metal box hidden under the bed. She said he saw documents from my failed timber business many years ago, contracts, debt records, and letters from creditors. I was too ashamed of that time in my life and didn't want to talk about it with her. I asked her if she was the one who placed the box beside my bed, but she said no, that she had never seen the box before and that it was her first time seeing it. Then she told me that after going through the documents inside, she realized I had unpaid debts, which confirmed Garrett's story. That's when I opened up and told her everything about the failed business, how traumatic it had been, and how I had confronted Garrett about the accusation that he was trying to sell my land. I told her that Garrett debunked it and explained that the person she overheard him talking to on the phone were investors he had to consult to help evaluate the land for future plans, not to sell it. Margaret responded by saying she was glad we could finally clear the air about Garrett. She apologized for making me think or assume Garrett was trying to sell the land. I told her it was nothing to worry about and explained that I hadn't shared the details of the box earlier because the old debts from my failed timber business had resurfaced, and Garrett had been standing in for me with the debtors. A week after, Margaret and Sheriff Tobin, a long-serving law enforcement officer in the area, came to see me. I was surprised when Margaret walked in with Sheriff Tobin. I've known Sheriff Tobin for 30 years. He remembered my family from better times. They both sat down in the living room, and Margaret told me she still had concerns. She started the conversation by saying that even though we had talked earlier about the accusations against Garrett and thought it was settled, something about Garrett still bothered her, especially that phone call she overheard. She said the details of the call were too accurate, and she still believed Gerald needed to be investigated. Margaret went on to say she had given Sheriff Tobin the documents from the old metal box, including the papers from the failed timber business, alongside the contracts, debt records, and letters from creditors. She also told me that she told the sheriff about the calls she overheard Garrett making regarding the landed property, which sounded like Gerald was planning to sell the land. I was just about to caution Margaret, asking why she'd bring all this up again when we had already settled the case, when Sheriff Tobin interrupted me. Sheriff Tobin told me he looked into the issue Margaret brought up and found that even if the debt mentioned in the letter was real, it had been legally resolved and closed years ago. Sheriff Tobin said that with this new information, he quietly built a case and got a warrant. Then Margaret revealed something she hadn't told me earlier because she wanted to be sure first. She said that while cleaning out the guest room closet, she found a locked filing cabinet that Garrett had forgotten to take. Inside were forged documents, fake authorization letters with my shaky signature, and a USB drive containing emails between Garrett and a shady land developer. She added that Garrett had unknowingly used my old laptop to write those emails, not realizing that autosave and cloud sync had kept everything. After showing me all this, I was shocked because all of this was confirming my worst fears about Garrett. I gave the sheriff the go-ahead to arrest Garrett and fully interrogate him. But this is where the story gets interesting, because Garrett never saw it coming. Looking back, it was now I realized that Garrett had deliberately purchased this old, expired debt from the original collection agency for a tiny fraction of its face value. He had then used this worthless piece of paper as psychological leverage against me, creating fear about creditors who no longer existed. The letter and other debt documents I found in that metal box was not evidence of real financial danger, but rather a tool of manipulation designed to justify his control over my money and property. He put those letters in the metal box near my bed, fully knowing I would see them, read them, and wrongly believe the lies he told about old debtors returning. But the scheme went far deeper than anyone had imagined. The meetings that Barnaby had observed between Garrett and the businessmen in suits were part of a complex land development deal. Garrett had been working with this developer to acquire my valuable forest property at a fraction of its true worth. The financial crisis he had created in my life was designed to force me into a position where selling the land would seem like my only option for survival. Every aspect of my financial struggles had been deliberately engineered. The declined debit cards, the reduced grocery budgets, the delayed medication payments, and the canceled services were all part of a calculated plan to make me dependent on Garrett while simultaneously draining my resources. He had been systematically weakening my position to set up the final devastating blow of taking my land. The emotional manipulation had been just as carefully planned as the financial abuse. Garrett's tearful visits, his stories about childhood trauma, and his claims about protecting me from creditors were all designed to keep me confused and compliant. He had studied my guilt about the failed timber business and my love for him as my son, then used these emotions as weapons against me. Before Sheriff Tobin made the move to arrest Garrett, he explained that this type of elder financial abuse was becoming increasingly common, especially cases involving family members who had legal or practical access to their elderly relatives' finances. The combination of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation created a perfect storm that left victims isolated, confused, and unable to seek help effectively. The most heartbreaking aspect of the revelation was understanding how long Garrett had been planning this betrayal. The scheme had not been a sudden decision made after my stroke, but rather a carefully developed strategy that had been waiting for the right moment to implement. My medical crisis had simply provided the perfect opportunity for him to put his plan into action. Queenetha's earlier warnings suddenly made complete sense. As Garrett's ex-wife, she had probably witnessed the early stages of his planning and recognized the signs of his growing obsession with controlling my assets. Her attempts to contact me had been genuine efforts to warn me about the danger I was facing, but my loyalty to Garrett had prevented me from listening to her concerns. The weight of understanding hit me like a physical blow. The son I had raised and loved had spent months, possibly years, planning to destroy my independence and steal my legacy. Every kind word, every expression of concern, and every gesture of care had been calculated moves in a game where I was nothing more than a target to be exploited. When Sheriff Tobin arrived at Garrett's house to make the arrest, my son's reaction was not what I had expected. There was no dramatic denial or angry outburst. Instead, Garrett simply looked defeated. His face showed a mixture of relief and despair that suggested the weight of his deception had been crushing him as much as it had been destroying me. The legal process that followed moved with surprising swiftness once all the evidence was assembled. Sheriff Tobin worked closely with Margaret and Dr. Martinez to compile a comprehensive case against Garrett. Barnaby Thorne's detailed journals provided an irrefutable timeline of suspicious meetings, while Queeneth contributed crucial documents that revealed Garrett's early financial planning and his history of manipulative behavior during their marriage. The court proceedings revealed the full extent of Garrett's crimes. He had stolen over $80,000 from my accounts through various fraudulent transactions and unauthorized transfers. The land development scheme would have cost me an additional $300,000 in property value if it had been completed successfully. The financial damage represented nearly my entire life savings and the legacy I had hoped to leave behind. But the numbers could not capture the emotional devastation of his betrayal. During the trial, I learned that Garrett had been planning this scheme for over 3 years, long before my stroke provided him with the perfect opportunity. He had studied my financial habits, identified my vulnerabilities, and developed strategies to exploit my love and trust. The calculated nature of his actions was more painful than the money he had stolen. The judge sentenced Garrett to 5 years in prison for elder abuse and financial fraud. All of my stolen assets were frozen and scheduled for return, though the legal process would take several months to complete. More importantly, the court issued permanent restraining orders that prevented Garrett from having any contact with me or access to my financial affairs in the future. After the sentencing, the judge allowed me a brief moment to speak with Garrett. His eyes were filled with tears as he finally opened up. He told me he didn't do it just for greed. He said that when my timber business failed, we lost everything. He remembered how his mom cried herself to sleep for years. He said he promised himself he'd never let us go through that again. After my stroke, he panicked. He no longer trusted my financial judgment and thought selling the land was the only way to protect us. His words pierced deeper than any betrayal. He wasn't just a thief, he was a frightened son. Standing in that courtroom, watching my son being led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I struggle to describe even now. There was relief that the nightmare was finally over and that justice had been served. There was satisfaction in knowing that my independence and dignity had been restored through the legal system. But there was also profound sadness for the relationship that had been destroyed and the son I had lost forever. The recovery process that followed was both practical and emotional. Margaret continued working with me to restore normal routines and rebuild my confidence in managing daily affairs. Dr. Martinez helped me process the trauma of the experience and develop strategies for protecting myself from future exploitation. Sheriff Tobin remained available as a resource and friend, checking in regularly to ensure my continued safety. My relationship with Queeneth improved significantly as we worked together to heal from Garrett's betrayal. She helped me understand the warning signs she had recognized years earlier and the reasons she had tried so desperately to contact me. Her support during the legal proceedings and recovery period showed me that not all family connections had been poisoned by Garrett's actions. The most important lesson I learned from this experience was that trust must be earned and verified, even with family members. Love and loyalty are precious gifts, but they should never blind us to evidence of harm or exploitation. The people who truly care about our welfare will welcome transparency and accountability in their actions on our behalf. My painful experience taught me 4 crucial lessons that every senior should remember. 1. Retain financial control. Never give anyone complete control over your finances, regardless of your relationship with them. Maintain access to your own bank accounts and financial statements, even if you need help managing daily transactions. 2. Beware isolation tactics. Be suspicious of anyone who tries to isolate you from other family members, friends, or professional advisors. Legitimate caregivers and family members want you to have multiple sources of support and oversight. People with harmful intentions work to cut off your connections to others who might notice problems. 3. Trust your gut. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you cannot immediately prove your concerns. If multiple people in your support network are expressing similar worries about your situation, take their concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as interference or jealousy. 4. Build a professional network. Establish relationships with professionals like doctors, lawyers, and financial advisors who have legal obligations to protect your interests. These relationships provide important safeguards against exploitation and give you resources to turn to when family dynamics become complicated or harmful. Remember that seeking help when you suspect abuse is not a betrayal of family loyalty. It is an act of self-preservation and dignity that protects not only yourself, but also prevents your loved ones from making terrible mistakes that will destroy relationships forever. Comment below about what part of this story affected you most. Like and subscribe if you want more content like this. Until next time, keep living with grace and purpose.